They made their way through the crowds, finally coming to a road that ran along the edge of the city and the sea. Considering that they couldn't get any closer to the ocean than that, it seemed like a pretty good place to start. At least it had, for the first hour and a half. A little after noon, Haldir's stomach had complained enough that he thought it necessary to eat something. While Sauron had begged to differ, Haldir told him that if they didn't get something to eat and rethink their plan, that he would just turn right around and head back home. That had seemed to be a good enough reason. Thus they were now sitting in the corner of an inn, Haldir snarfing down the meal in front of him while Sauron picked slowly at his. Apparently he hadn't truly gotten into the eating thing yet. In the last couple of weeks he had eaten at least one meal a day, usually two. It seemed that he just ate when the thought entered his mind, or when he couldn't ignore the fact that he was hungry. While he was still a lot thinner than he probably should have been, it wasn't quite to the disturbingly so level anymore.
So,
Haldir said between mouthfuls,
what do we do now?
The road hasn't ended yet. We still have a ways we can go on it.
Sauron replied as he chased peas around his plate with a fork. After watching what he was doing for a minute and then shaking his head sadly at the reinforcement of his belief that Sauron hadn't really matured at all, Haldir spoke again.
The road is getting old. I just want to know where we have to go and go there and get it done.
We've gone over this, I believe.
Do you want me to ask then?
No.
Haldir frowned, pushing his plate away thoughtfully. A moment later, a woman came over and picked up his plate, but before she left, he cleared his throat. She looked back at him.
If we were looking for Osse, where should we go?
She smiled.
You're very close. Just follow the road along for another 10 minutes or so, and then there will be one that branches off to the left. He's down that one.
Thank you.
With a quick nod, she hurried off again.
Well, that was easy enough,
Haldir said, smiling. Sauron, of course, was not smiling at all.
You just had to ask, didn't you?
Well, it's not like we aren't going that way anyways. Now I know that we're not just walking around hopelessly.
Couldn't leave well enough alone.
Come on, don't be so glum. It's not going to do us any harm at all.
He looked at Sauron's half-eaten meal.
You done?
I suppose.
Good. Let's go then.
He quickly counted out the coins for their meals and they set out once more. As the lady had said, after about 10 minutes they found a road leading off the main one. While there had been others branching off, they had always been on the right side, going more inland. This was the first Haldir could remember seeing on the left. They turned down the lane, passing between buildings on either side to find that the road quickly became a bridge over the water to a small island not far out. Haldir, of course, had no worries about this and continued to walk, glad that they wouldn't have to be searching anymore. Sauron, on the other hand, did not look nearly as comfortable, which was understandable and even expected. So when Haldir knew that Sauron was not a step or two behind him anymore, he did not stop, but just called over his shoulder.
Come on, we're just about there.
Sauron did catch up, but walked cautiously along the middle, looking down onto the water that was lapping softly at the bridge. After watching him for a second, Haldir sighed.
I have no idea what you think you're going to get done here, considering that you can't even comfortably walk on a bridge.
I'll be fine.
Haldir just rolled his eyes. Not long after that, they reached the other end, stopping before a tall silver gate. Two elves were standing just inside it and considered Haldir and Sauron, their faces completely expressionless.
What do you want?
The one on the left asked.
We're here to see Osse.
Sauron replied.
What business do you have with him?
That will be between Osse and myself.
Well then, what are your names?
This is Haldir, and I am...
For a moment he paused, but then in a strained voice continued.
Yewer. However, that name won't mean anything to him.
Then why will you not give us a name that will mean something?
I cannot say it.
The two elves exchanged glances, turning back to them with faces a bit more cold than they had been a moment before.
Why do you think that he will see you if you would not tell your business or your proper name?
If I could speak to him for a moment, he would know who I was.
Again, the elves looked at each other, but then the one who had spoken the whole time nodded and the other opened the gate.
I will take you in, but you have but a minute. If he does not recognize you, then you will have to leave.
Sauron went in without replying, Haldir right behind him. One elf stayed behind, watching the gate, while the other led Sauron and Haldir forward. A few yards away from the gate, the bridge ended. There was a high arch cut right into the rock of the island, which ended after a couple of feet. Once on the other side of the arch, Haldir found himself looking in on the most impressive building he had ever seen. There were pillars of white marble holding up the lofty roof, which really hardly seemed to be a roof at all, considering all of the openings in it. Though these seabirds flew in and out, their cries were slightly drowned out by the sound of water rushing and falling all around them. The openings also seemed to be the only way that light entered the dim hall, as there was not a torch to be seen anywhere. That also made sense. The large floor in front of them was more than half covered with pools, while fountains could be spotted anywhere he looked. The place was just about literally swimming. Sauron glanced about everything, a small grimace crossing his face. Again, Haldir wondered why he was just about torturing himself and coming to that place. True, he thought it was beautiful, but he knew Sauron didn't think so. As they walked along, Haldir noticed that there were also tons of people there, walking about the pools or sitting beside them, talking softly to one another. Apparently, Sauron noticed also.
There are so many people here. Why would it be odd for us to come also?
He asked the elf who was leading them.
These people have a reason to be here that is known, or are of the Teleri.
He looked back at Sauron for a moment, seeming to sum him up.
And somehow I thought they are of the Teleri. My guess would be Nordorine.
Sauron looked about to snap something back, but bit his lip. Haldir was actually quite impressed. They turned down a small hallway to the side, coming to the door at the end. The elf knocked on the door.
My lord?
He said.
Yes?
A voice answered from inside.
There are 2 elves here to see you.
Haldir glanced over at Sauron, who looked both perturbed and indignant. It had always been obvious that Sauron was not in any way, shape, or form happy about having to be on the same level as Haldir. On the few occasions when the fact that he did blend in so well with the rest of them had been brought up, he had always been on the verge of flipping out. Since that had happened twice in the last few minutes, Haldir thought that he'd be in a really nasty mood. However, to Haldir's surprise, he quickly cleared his face of his glower and took on an almost pleasant expression. Considering that Haldir hadn't been around him when he was that way much, and since now he couldn't figure out why he was doing so, it was a bit creepy, really.
Let them in.
The elf pulled open the door and motioned them in, and then followed in himself. The room they were in now was not very wide, but tall, a bit darker than the large area they had first came into since the ceiling was so high. There were some scattered chairs and tables and shelves filled with seashells and other various things. Haldir was instantly drawn to them, as he had never seen anything like them before, but he restrained himself and followed behind Sauron towards the figure at the other side of the room. Finally, they were just a few feet away and stopped. The man, who could be no other than Osse, had extremely pale hair that almost seemed tinged with green in the dim light. He appeared to have his attention pretty focused on whatever he was doing. So they stood there. It had been a couple rather uncomfortable moments when Sauron's patience seemed to run out.
Osse, I haven't all day here.
The elf looked at Sauron with a sort of shocked anger. However, Sauron didn't seem to notice at all. He was looking down at Osse, tapping his foot slightly. At his voice, Osse paused, as though trying to place it. Then he suddenly looked up.
Well?
Sauron pressed. Osse stared at him for a moment, unmoving. After simply sitting like that for a moment, he looked at the elf and nodded towards the door. Apparently, even more shocked than he had been, the elf bowed and left, shutting the door behind him.
What?
Osse said, almost to himself, curiosity shining out of his teal eyes.
What?
Sauron repeated.
What sort of response was that?
Osse frowned thoughtfully.
I didn't think you were allowed to come out here.
I'm not. Unless Haldir comes along too.
Sauron answered, taking a step to the side so that Osse could see Haldir. Haldir smiled meekly.
Sylvan?
Osse asked, smiling slowly. Haldir nodded.
And how do you find the sea?
Sauron took a deep breath and let it out slowly.
Really? Can this wait for another time, perhaps?
He said, bringing Osse's attention back to him.
Why have you come here? It's common knowledge that you have not been overly fond of the sea for many years now.
Osse said coolly.
You are awfully quick to come to conclusions,
Sauron answered. They both looked at each other for a moment, and then Osse leaned back in his chair.
Have a seat,
he said, gesturing to some of the chairs around them. Haldir silently did so, sitting in the chair closest to where he had stood. Sauron, on the other hand, opted for the one nearer to Osse.
Again, what brings you here?
I just wanted to talk. That's all.
Osse raised a brow.
To talk, you say? You know, you can listen to the sound of your own voice wherever it is that you dwell now, just as well as you can here.
Even with this remark, Sauron's expression remained unchanged. Haldir found it interesting that Sauron really could keep from scowling for so long.
Talking to oneself is not nearly as satisfying as speaking to another, though, don't you think?
Then don't you talk to the elf? Haldir, didn't you say?
Both of them looked over at Haldir, which just about made him have a squirm fest. While he could handle Sauron's piercing gaze now, both he and Osse staring at him at once was a bit too much. It was rather uncomfortable, to say the least. Sauron looked away first, turning back to Osse.
But he does not understand everything as we understand it. He is of the firstborn. We, on the other hand, are Ainur. Yes, I could speak to him, but why would I wish to, when there are those of the same order as myself, living so near, whose thoughts are easier to identify with?
Haldir was a bit surprised to notice that there was something very different about Sauron's voice now as he spoke. At first it had not been very apparent, but the more he listened, the more he noticed it. There was a very subtle change to it, something that made it almost pleasant to listen to, as odd as the thought was for Haldir to get his mind around. Osse did not answer. Sauron, too, leaned back, a flicker of a smile upon his face.
Is it really that strange that I should seek you out so that I may speak with you?
He prodded, the alluring undertone of his voice a bit stronger. Slowly, Osse replied.
I suppose not.
Haldir watched and listened silently, a bit amazed at how the conversation was unfolding. Already the cold demeanor that Osse had displayed was melting, and they had only been there a few minutes. He became a bit uneasy about what this could portend.
And of all our people, who else should I wish to see besides you?
For a second, a spark of the distance Osse had shown moments ago resurfaced.
But why would you want to see me? Should not one of Ole's people be more fitting than I?
Sauron did not look fazed in the least.
Perhaps in what hobbies we are more inclined to participate in, we are different. That is correct. However, in our ambitions, are we truly so?
He said to soothe the momentary setback. Osse seemed to consider his words, looking off distantly into the room.
At a time, did we not serve the same Vala?
Osse shot him a startled look, but Sauron pressed on.
Yes, you repented that decision, perhaps, but it does not change the fact that at the time you made it, and thought it the proper choice. We are very similar in that we both were after the same thing.
But it was not for us.
Osse protested weakly.
No, perhaps not.
Sauron stood up and walked around a bit, picking up some of the things from the shelves and looking at them. The last of these he held for a moment and turned back towards the room, looking at it carefully, running a finger along its intricate metalwork.
On a time, did I not make this?
He asked. While he seemed a bit surprised by the abrupt change of subject, he nodded.
Yes, in Almarin.
I remember.
Sauron slowly held it up to the dim light, turning it around to inspect all of the sides. His look was distant, obviously in the past.
It was the first shell you had found,
he said, suddenly.
You wanted something around it to protect it, to ensure that it would not be broken, as it was very fragile. Most of us were busy aiding Aule with the lamps, and so it would have been unlikely that Iddy would have been able to do so. But you asked me, and although I had work that probably should have been seen to, well, I've always been the rebellious sort, hadn't I?
He looked over at Osse and grinned. Osse nodded again.
From the beginning, almost.
So I did as you requested.
He softly set the shell back upon the shelf and sat down once more.
I'm surprised you still have it.
As you said, it was the first shell that I have found. It was important.
Yes, but it had also been worked upon by me, and not long after that, I joined with the enemy.
To this statement, Osse made no reply.
Yet, perhaps,
Sauron said slowly, carefully observing Osse's posture and expression.
Perhaps rebellion is not always such a bad thing. That can be seen from this, can it not?
True, it was beneficial once. But then you rebelled to the point that no good could come from it.
Yes, that is true. I was blinded by my desire for power, and my wish to order things in a way that I thought would be most advantageous to all. Now I can see where I went wrong with that, however.
Upon processing this last statement, Haldir instantly knew it was a lie. Sauron had not repented his ways in the least. There was no way that he thought what he had done was wrong. Knowing this, Haldir would have said something, only that beguiling tone in Sauron's voice had completely dissolved his ability to do so. Even as Haldir came to this conclusion, Sauron glanced over at him, his face still appearing very sincere. However, there was a momentary glint in his eyes that reinforced everything that Haldir had just thought. Of course, his attention did not remain on Haldir long. He turned back to Osse.
In the time I've been here, I have been able to think back on many things. Through this I have learned that I was mistaken in many of the beliefs I had. However, I have no hope that Iddy would believe me on this, and so I came to you. You are the only other here who had similar beliefs as me, even though long ago. You understand what I thought, and why I thought it.
What are you asking?
Osse inquired, his expression very grim.
I'm asking you to help me regain my standings, so that I could be as I once was. You have no idea how humiliating it is to be degraded as I have been by this, to be no more than of the Moraquendi.
Osse grinned slightly.
I can guess.
Maybe, but I doubt you would get close.
Now Osse was silent, evidently thinking very deeply about what had just been requested of him. Again, Haldir wished that he could bring up the fact that Sauron was continuing his string of lies, but again he found himself incapable. Yet just at that moment, when Osse seemed about to reply, there was a knock on the door.
Come in,
Osse said.
I heard that 2 people called on you much earlier this afternoon.
A female voice floated in from the shadows of the doorway.
I just came to see if there was anything I could.
Her words abruptly stopped as she came further into the room and looked at the figures seated there. First she glanced at Haldir, then Osse, and lastly Sauron, who seemed to be the real reason for her sudden silence. Sauron stood up and actually bowed slightly.
Uinen, you're as beautiful as ever,
he said suavely. It was one of the few things that Sauron had said that Haldir had agreed upon, although he had no idea why Sauron would have ever voiced such a thing. Haldir thought that she was probably the most beautiful person he had ever seen. Well, except for perhaps Galadriel, but that was probably getting into just personal feelings there. Uinen's face flushed at Sauron's comment. However, by the way she held herself, she was also quite angry.
What are you doing here?
She asked, frostily.
Visiting,
Sauron answered.
I would say please, but as I don't think it means much to you, will you leave?
Why do you want me to go? I haven't done anything,
he said, feigning innocence.
I want you to leave, now,
she said, and even though she did so softly and calmly, everything about her voice exuded authority.
Now!
Sauron looked at her for a moment more, and then nodded.
As you wish,
he said, walking towards the door. After digesting the scene before him, Haldir quickly got up and made to follow. Sauron was already at the door by this time, and had paused next to Uinen. Apparently, he was talking to her, but since it was in such a soft whisper, he couldn't even hear the words. However, then Sauron leaned back, smiling devilishly. Uinen just stared at him, almost horror-struck, and then slapped him hard across the face. Osse must have gotten up at the same time that Haldir had, and so was at his left when this occurred. Both of them stopped right where they were. Sauron had his eyes squeezed shut and a hand against his jaw. Slowly he squinted one eye open and turned to look at Uinen. She pointed dangerously at him and then spoke in that same deadly quiet voice.
Don't you ever bring that up again, or so help me.
And with that she promptly turned around and left the room. Haldir could not help but glance over at Osse for a moment. He seemed to know that Haldir was looking at him and turned his way, shrugging. By now, Sauron was standing straightly again and no longer squinting, although his hand was still rubbing his jaw.
Well,
he said slowly.
I suppose we had ought to go.
Yes, I think that would be best,
Osse answered, seeming to decide that he didn't want to know what had caused Uinen to act the way she had. Sauron immediately left the room, walking swiftly down the hall. When he did so, Haldir began to follow, but Osse stopped him for a second.
Haldir?
He said, seeming to be both wondering if he had the right name and trying to get his attention.
Yes?
Haldir said, pausing.
Expect company soon.
Haldir frowned.
What do you mean?
Your family. They're making their way over the sea. They will be here in a day or two.
Still staring at him, Haldir tried to figure out what he was saying, and then it dawned on him.
My family? Here?
Osse smiled slightly.
Yes, expect them.
He looked down the hall at the receding form of Sauron.
I would go now, if you are supposed to be around him all the time.
Haldir looked down the hall and then nodded his head.
Thank you.
Osse just smiled again, and then shut the door as Haldir hurried to catch up with Sauron. By the time he did, Sauron was already at the end of the arch. Haldir, in an amazing show of intelligence, was able to keep from asking as to what Sauron had said to Uinen. Yet, since he was terribly curious, it didn't mean that he would never ask. He'd just wait a bit. Sauron marched out the gate without acknowledging the elves at all, so Haldir did so instead. Afterwards, he wished he hadn't, as they just glared suspiciously at him. So they walked across the bridge to the road, and then back to the corral. Haldir was glad that Sauron seemed to have a good memory for directions and that sort of thing. If it had been up to him, they probably would have ended up everywhere but the place they wanted to get to. Sauron did not make any fuss at all when they got their horses and simply mounted and went off. While he had not said a word or given Haldir any death glares, it was obvious that he was peeved. Taking into consideration what had happened the last time he had made his presence known when Sauron had been mad, Haldir decided that he'd just tag along and be quiet for a while. While the ride there had been just as quiet, the ride back was disturbingly silent. Haldir felt terribly uncomfortable with it, but did not have the nerve to speak. That was, until Sauron brought the whole thing up himself. First, he had smirked a bit, and then seemed about ready to laugh. However, then he had glanced at Haldir and stifled it.
Well, that was interesting,
he stated.
Pardon?
Haldir asked. Interesting was not what he thought he would say. Given 100 guesses, interesting would not have been any of the words he'd supposed Sauron would say.
I didn't think I'd even get as far as I did. I believe he would have actually spoken on my behalf before the Valar. Fancy that.
So that was your whole grand scheme?
Haldir reflected on it for a moment and then nodded.
I must say, it was pretty decent, all things considered.
You think so? It wasn't my best work. Just a sort of desperation attempt. If only Uinen had stayed out a bit longer, I could have had it.
He frowned now about this, but then smiled again.
Good thing that I didn't have my hopes up on it at all. I always get things stolen away from me right when everything seems to be going my way. This wasn't any exception.
Well, he was taking a lot better than Haldir would have thought he would. Letting him have his space for a while had really paid off. Haldir put it in his mind for something to remember. Since he seemed to be in a somewhat talkative mood, Haldir decided to take advantage of it.
How did you do that?
He asked.
What do you mean?
Well, when we first got there, Osse wasn't really that happy to have you as company. But then at the end, as you said, he seemed about ready to grant your request. It was crazy sitting there listening to you. Your voice.
Haldir searched for the word, but couldn't find it.
Your voice just got different. It was strange.
One of the tricks you learn when a major business of yours is sucking up to people and manipulating them to your purposes. Eloquent speaking is very important in that, as well as having a persuasive voice. I've had a lot of time to hone the skills.
It was creepy.
Sauron shrugged.
To you? Yes, I bet it was. Nothing I could have really done about that, though. Unless I was trying to trip you up in the whole thing, too. That just would have taken too much energy, though.
Haldir rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully for a second, and then continued.
And what did you say to Uinen that made her slap you and all?
He asked quietly. At this time, Sauron smiled even wider. It was so strange that the whole affair seemed to amuse him so much now, even when his attempt had failed. Maybe for once he was looking on the bright side of things and decided that the fact he had gotten close counted a bit.
I just brought up something from long, long ago that she probably didn't want to recall.
Haldir cocked an eyebrow.
Which would be...
Continuing to smile, Sauron rubbed his cheek, which even now still had a bright red mark across it.
Well, you know, there was a time when I was considerably popular among my peers. During that, I had once helped her with something, and afterwards she believed that she fancied me a bit.
Haldir blinked a couple of times, unable to believe that what he had heard could really mean what he had thought it meant.
No,
he said, still unable to grasp it.
Yes.
Sauron mocked back at him.
See, she only thought she did. I knew she really didn't, because it was painfully obvious to everybody that it'd be Osse and her in the end. Yet I couldn't really get it through her head for a while. Of course it went through her head when I left, and became all evil and stuff.
Wow.
Was about all Haldir really felt he could say.
So, since she came and bashed in on our party, I decided to remind her of that. Which, as you saw, wasn't taken very well. From her standpoint, I mean, how embarrassing would that be? To have for a short time been overly fond of someone who became a Dark Lord.
At this point, he came so close to laughing that he snorted once in his effort to keep from doing so. Haldir just shook his head and tried to ignore the fact that he probably had the most deranged person in Arda riding a horse next to him.